Welcome and cheers. My name is Jeremy Frank, and this is a new web series that we're starting at LA Opera called Opera Happy Hour with Jeremy Frank. This is my living room, this is my piano. This is also a place where I never thought I might ever possibly be greeting thousands of people. Hopefully, you are thousands of people, but you're certainly welcome. We decided to start this new web series in order to reach out to you at a time where we can't be with you physically in our theater. But it also provides a really awesome opportunity for me to pick a theme for the week. Today's theme will be overtures, and I'll explain more about that in a second. Part of the idea is to pair that theme with a cocktail or a drink. Cheers. And then I'll spend about half an hour this afternoon talking to you about that theme, elucidating how it fits in throughout the course of opera history. I'll play some musical examples and give a little performance. And hopefully we'll have a great time and hopefully not be too tipsy by the end of the episode. So, as I said, today's theme is overtures. The word overture comes from French, ouverture, and that actually just means an opening. And many operas over the course of particularly early mid-Baroque opera and classical opera start with a symphonic piece that serves as an introduction to the opera. Often, those pieces of symphonic music are in two parts, like a slow introduction part and then a faster part. But as the overture evolved over time, we find that composers start getting pretty creative with the idea of what they're going to do musically. And sometimes the music isn't even in two parts. Sometimes it's in more than two parts. Sometimes it's what we musicians call programmatic, meaning that it helps either set the scene or tell the story of the opera, the beginning of the story of the opera. Sometimes it's a purely incidental piece of music. That means it doesn't have any direct connection to the drama of the story. It's just real pretty. And there are all different kinds of things in between. And as decades turned into centuries, turned into our opera repertoire, we see all different kinds of examples. So let me have a little sip and let's jump in. For those of you with a very keen eye, you can tell that I'm editing and that most of my ice cubes in my delicious drink have already started to melt and my glass is sweating a little bit. I did all of the hard playing and the smart thinking and talking before I told you what I paired all of this theme and music with. So, I chose today to pair our episode with an Aperol Spritz. And there's a reason why, not just because this drink is ubiquitous, particularly right now in Italy, but because it is a kind of drink that is referred to, those of you who also have a bar at home know this, it's called an aperitif, or in Italian, an aperitivo. Aperitivos come from a Latin term which means an opener. And the drink is meant to be an opener for a meal. If you travel, particularly in northern Italy, but you can find this in Rome too, late in the afternoon, about the time that it is now, 5 or 6, you'll see cafes and restaurants with sort of a buffet of snacky foods, prosciuttos, cheeses, delicious breads, little finger foods, light pasta, things like that. And then you order a drink like this, often with an amaro. In this case, this is Aperol, which is a bitter, and it's meant to stimulate the appetite. And though it's difficult to believe when you're traveling in Italy that this hasn't existed since the Roman times, actually, in reality, the tradition of the aperitivo comes from the late 18th century, from 1786, from a guy, they think, named Antonio Carpano. And he was one of the people who first started bottling and inventing vermouth. And he promoted vermouth as a digestif, as something to help promote you being able to digest your meal. So it's a relatively light drink. My husband made a beautiful one of these. This is 2 ounces of Prosecco, 1¼ ounce of Aperol. We might have poured a little heavy there. And a splash of soda, and often served on ice. Usually with a straw, but I'm keeping it classy for the podcast. We thought it might be interesting, since this is the first episode, if I took an opportunity to tell you a little bit about my overture as well. So it started in 19 clickety clack. Actually, I'm not running for president, and I'm also not a cast member on Saturday Night Live. So you don't actually need to know that part of the story. But opera is such a all-encompassing art form, and actually, unlike some of my friends and colleagues, I didn't fall in love with opera all at once. When I was growing up in Montana, which also seems a little bit like the least likely place to fall in love with opera, I kind of fell in love with the parts of opera first. I fell in love with drama, with straight theater plays, kind of hardcore stuff that way. I fell in love with orchestral music. I fell in love with language, particularly the French language. And all of these things sort of set up a row of dominoes that were just sort of ripe for being tipped over. I had my first live opera experience when I went to undergraduate school, and suddenly everything, all the pieces clicked, and I saw what an amazing, multifaceted art form this is. And it's kind of interesting and odd to be, proselytizing about how great that is in the isolation of my living room to the isolation of your living room. But nonetheless, there is a magic there that I feel, and that I know a lot of you feel. For those of you who already are fans of LA Opera or opera in general, hopefully this will just be a fun evening, afternoon. It's a beautiful Friday afternoon, kind of at happy hour time when I'm filming this. And for those of you who have not ever been to the opera yet, there are so many opportunities right now to experience opera for free and world-class opera, and we'll talk about those later in the episode. But I hope you jump into the deep end of the pool with both feet, and maybe a little bit of social lubrication, so that you kind of make it through. But anyway, so we talked about how overtures started as 2-part pieces, and that happens even, the earliest operas that we have, going back to the early 1600s with Monteverdi, actually start with orchestral introductions too. That is perhaps not surprising. They are not as large in scope. Some of them last probably 25 or 30 seconds in the case, for instance, of Il ritorno d'Ulisse in Patria. But the other piece that he's super well known for, L'Incoronazione di Poppea, that opera actually has a perhaps 2-minute orchestral piece that introduces it. It is not multipartite, meaning it's all one musical fabric from start to finish. But that one does kind of grab the audience's attention. I'm going to time travel really quickly here. So I'm talking about opera in the 1600s, but opera was a really rowdy and social activity, particularly in Paris in the 19th century. So you would have these huge 5-act pieces and rowdy crowds who were drinking, surprise, surprise. Some of the men there were dating the dancer ladies who appeared but only in Act 3. So they were milling about, having full-on conversations as the piece was getting started. And the overture was an opportunity to just settle everybody down and get people seated, or at least try to. that makes the overture seem like an afterthought, but in fact, it's anything but. One composer in particular changed the entire scope of and possibilities for the overture, and that man is Mozart. So at the very beginning of this episode, I edited in a little teensy tiny 7-second clip of me playing one of the most famous, recognizable overture themes. And I'm going to play a slightly more extended version of that theme for you now. It goes something like this. For you opera aficionados, you absolutely recognize that as the overture to Le Nozze di Figaro, or The Marriage of Figaro. And it's a super joyful work that I think doesn't capture exactly the point-for-point plot of Nozze, but it captures the effervescent joy and playfulness that is embodied so frequently in that plot. Now, that's not the only kind of overture that Mozart wrote. Particularly in what we call the opera serie, the serious operas that are about often themes from antiquity or mythological stories, Mozart tried to set a much more somber tone, and he tried to capture the drama of the story already. And a great example of that is the overture from Idomeneo. Another example that is high in drama is the overture to Don Giovanni. That captures the gravitas of the story, particularly the ending of the story, with its kind of, well, I would say heavy-handed moral, except for I kind of believe in some ways Giovanni merits his demise at the end. There are two interesting things, highly interesting things about the overture to Don Giovanni. One is that the piece doesn't finish at all as a complete number before the rest of the opera goes on. So often these orchestral pieces completely finish, applause is taken, and then the opera continues. In the case of Don Giovanni, it sort of gets to a little half resting place that is a little tenuous and doesn't sound like an ending. And then we launch into the drama of Act 1. And because of that, as in the overture to Idomeneo, the tone is set from the very first beat of the piece, of the overture even. The other thing that is interesting about the overture to Don Giovanni is that it's a perfect example of Mozart quoting musical ideas that are going to happen later in the piece. So there's, of course, those of you who love Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, there's a cartoon from decades ago with the Don Giovanni, bum 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 theme in the cartoon. That theme is quoted in the overture to Don Giovanni as well, and other tunes. Now that idea of the overture containing or even consisting of tunes from the piece itself became a huge part and parcel in comic opera throughout the 19th century and operetta, and made its way into American musicals of the Golden Age era. So if you think of the term overture and think of like kind of an 8-minute collection of your favorite tunes from Candide or from West Side Story, you're not mistaken. And actually the roots of that come from our world, from opera. And just there are differences, and most of the overtures that I've referenced so far come from Mozart or earlier, from people like Handel or Monteverdi, from the very beginnings of opera. But Mozart was super influential as a composer across the board. In so many ways, his later music was very forward-looking, and other geniuses like Beethoven, who really only wrote one opera, took some of the farthest reaching ideas that Mozart had and expounded on them and really created the entire Romantic era of music. Other innovators came along a few decades later and took some of those forward ideas and pushed the envelope even farther. In fact, I have a conductor friend. If you're seeing this, Gary Weedo, just know how frequently I reference you and this story. But when he talks about composers like Wagner, who was one of the biggest revolutionaries in music, he talks about him in terms of him having broken Western music. Part of that exists because, when I play Mozart, I might end with happy sounding tonal music like this. For instance. However, Wagner makes a total technique of choosing some of the juiciest and most dissonant chords possible, like the Tristan chord, and resolving to other thorny, weird chords. I don't have a Tristan score in front of me, so that was Tipsy Jeremy playing Wagner, not actual Wagner himself. Don't be fooled. Anyway, Wagner took many of the most forward ideas from Beethoven and the people who were inspired by him and revolutionized harmony, form. In fact, Wagner was such a fan of drama that he aspired to create what is referred to in German as Gesamtkunstwerk, or an all-encompassing art form that takes the orchestra, takes the chorus, takes the soloist, takes the sets, takes the theater itself. He and his team constructed a theater for his own works in Bayreuth, of course. He wanted to control every aspect of it, so all of those unified forces came together to create one unified dramatic idea. Part of the reason I bring him up is because he took this idea of overture and also revolutionized the idea. So often when we end in that happy tonal music, if the overture ends that way, we're very likely to call that music an overture. If it ends in that halfway closed way that springs out into the drama, we call it something else, usually. We call it a prelude. If we're in German repertoire, we call it a Vorspiel, and that's what Wagner tends to call it. So, like I said, this is a great time to be watching opera for free. Both the Met Opera, who also had to close the theater, of course, they've been offering free streaming performances. And when this airs next Tuesday, I believe we're either right at the beginning of or right in the midst of them broadcasting the entire Ring cycle, one show per night for most of next week. If you saw it already and are like, we're over those planks or whatever, you might check out. Don't be scared. You'll have to navigate the German language a little bit. But you could look at the Vienna Staatsoper or the Vienna State Opera's page, and they too are broadcasting archived performances of the Ring cycle. The reason I bring the Ring cycle up is because its Vorspiel in the first of the four operas that make up that piece is also highly revolutionary. In many ways, Wagner sets out to create an entire universe from nothing. As the palette from which he can make all 15 or 16 hours of opera spring. I'm not going to play 15 hours of opera right now, I promise. But I am going to play maybe the first 30 seconds or so of Das Rheingold. I think perhaps there's an homage to Mozart. Mozart's overture to the Magic Flute is in 3 flats in E flat major. There are lots of reasons that's true for the Magic Flute. It's a piece that celebrates and exploits themes of masonry. There are three of everything. There are three ladies who save Tamino. There are three spirits who guide Tamino. The first time Tamino sings an aria, there are three flats in his key signature. And I think Wagner takes something about the pureness and the nobility of that key and chooses to create his universe out of that. It starts with a single unison E flat. When we play this at the piano, in order to imitate the amount of sound that comes from the orchestra, we usually play it as an octave. And then 4 measures later, only one other note is introduced, making a perfect fifth. So we start with just one note, then we have just 2 notes. Then a few measures later, a horn call is heard. Just a single solo horn playing a long arpeggio as if it were some kind of Waldhorn, some natural horn. That horn is joined by another horn, and then another horn, and another horn, until 8 horns total are making this call of the universe back and forth and back and forth. Then the strings enter, and they start playing the ripples of the Rhine River, and they depict this shimmering, watery universe. And slowly, piece by piece, this whole world comes into shape. Now, that process is elongated. You can imagine for a set of operas that last 15 or 16 hours, this isn't going to just take 30 seconds. I'm only going to play 30 seconds. But really, we stay in one harmony for nearly 5 minutes. And you would think that would be boring or tiresome, but instead it's a miracle. And if you don't believe me, take a listen after you see this on Tuesday. Here's a tiny idea of what it might sound like, but really drop your ears into the orchestration on this one for sure. I could go on and on and on, but at LA Opera they said, no, really, like a half hour is enough of this. Plus, my drink is sitting here, and I haven't taken a sip in a long time. Through the magic of editing, I wanted to share a performance that I give for you of one of the most famous opera overtures, of course transcribed by me for the piano and with some cuts so that this doesn't go on all day. But the overture I wanted to play for you comes from Rossini's Il Barbiere di Siviglia, or The Barber of Seville. I have mentioned Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny at some point in this podcast. And of course, you can, if you remember those cartoons, you can think of, Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, Bugs Bunny on Elmer Fudd's head, massaging with his feet and giving him a haircut and a shave. And feel free to imagine that while you go. One thing that you should know before I play this overture is that Rossini did a certain kind of compositional technique or trick. It makes the music feel really exciting. I'm sure most of you know the term crescendo, which is when music starts soft and grows over time and gets ultimately louder. We musicians often refer to a Rossini crescendo, which is created in a slightly different way, kind of like how organists create crescendo. Since you can't like make an organ get softer or louder by mechanical means, what you do is you pull more stops and get more pipes playing at the same time, and that creates the effect of a crescendo. And that's exactly what Rossini does with his writing. So, for instance, when we get to this famous part of the overture, the first time that happens, there's a limited number of players playing. That music repeats 3 times, and then later in the overture, it repeats in a different key 3 more times. Each first time, it starts with the small number of players, and then more are added for the second time, and almost everybody's playing for the third time. So, as you hopefully enjoy my performance, when we get to that part, if you've had more sips of your cocktail than I have, and you find yourself singing along, you can know that Rossini sanctioned it. keep mentioning these various institutions who have started streaming music, and I want you to definitely keep your eye out for that. I'm super proud to say that LA Opera is one of them. And we're actually creating new content like this, or like the LAO at Home series of recitals that our wonderful young artists have been doing. Huge shout out to you guys. Great job. Keep up the good work. You can see those often live streamed on Facebook. Check the website for details. There are also a few other local companies here in Greater Los Angeles who are doing live streaming, and I don't know these people in particular, so I'm gonna just give them a little bit of love as a shout out. But we as a city should be hugely proud of the work that Pacific Opera Project is doing, and they are streaming content too, so please check them out. It's not just large institutions like the Met or the Vienna Staatsoper or other theaters throughout Germany and Europe, but there really is a lot of content out there. And sort of in conclusion of this part, just remember that LA Opera and all of these institutions are not for profit. I know the world is really in dire straits now, and it will be for a while. It is temporary, I'm certain. But if you are able to help out the institutions that you're learning from, please do. We will thank you now, we will thank you later, and we will welcome you hopefully soon back in person. As I said, this is the beginning of a web series. I already have some ideas for future episodes, which you'll see in about a week's time, and then hopefully about once a week something will come out. Look for episodes about how Wagner's music is like the original drinking game, and also a show about famous drinking scenes in opera and all of the good choices that people make when they're under the influence and singing. Thanks so much for joining me. I actually can't wait to see you again, and in the meantime, cheers.